Hi, welcome back to the Roaring Twenties podcast with me, Isabella Skeekey.
And me, Sam Pennifold. This is our second episode, and following on from last time with our second episode in our continued series on race in America.
Black Lives Matter is said to be the most consequential political uprising we've seen since the 1960s. The voices that are standing out most are those of young people that have taken to the streets in large numbers across many cities around the world, with prominent voices being heard from our athletes, actors, university lecturers and students.
One such person is Ayanda, the political secretary for the KCL African Caribbean Society. She has kindly agreed to come talk to us about the society and the Black Lives Matter movement with its wider impact on British society and across the world. Hello.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. For anyone who doesn't know about the society or what they do, can you just tell us a little bit about it, kind of your mission statement, I guess?
Definitely. The African Caribbean Society, also known as ACS, is a society at King's that allows students at both undergraduate and graduate level to experience, partake in, and celebrate African and Caribbean culture in a social capacity, as well as providing education about history and current issues.
During lockdown, obviously we've all had a lot more time on our hands, a lot more free time. I just wondered, how have you responded to the Black Lives Matter movement?
Yeah, so obviously there have been a lot of protests going on, and it's been a very difficult decision whether to attend a protest or not, considering the global pandemic we're experiencing. I've personally decided not to attend any protests, but I've been using the time I've had to educate myself. Specifically, I'm a big reader, so the best book I've read so far on this issue is by a woman called Rennie Edo-Lodge, and it's called Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. And after reading that book, I have become convinced that every single person in this country should pick it up at some point, because it not only gives the perspective of why Black individuals can become fatigued in a way or tired of having to constantly explain our experiences, but also of incidences of history and of racism in this country that people don't learn in school. So it gives a vital British perspective on anti-Blackness and racism.
I mentioned in the last podcast, the author has done a podcast as well, but more focused on recent issues in politics, in British politics. If no one's listened to it yet, I really recommend it. But moving on, having had more time to reflect on politics, how were you affected when seeing this video of George Floyd's murder?
At first, I personally avoided watching the video of George Floyd's murder for at least a week after his death, because personally, and I know this applies to a lot of other Black people, it is traumatic to watch Black people being brutalized. George Floyd's murder was akin to a 21st century lynching. And because of technology and phones and social media in particular, the world has been forced into a new reckoning with white supremacy and anti-Blackness. But for Black people, when we saw George Floyd be murdered in the way he was, we saw ourselves, our brothers and sisters, our mothers and our fathers lying on the floor with a knee on our necks too. So my reaction has been one of sadness, of anger, of hopelessness, but also of elation and joy to see Black people and allies worldwide standing up and speaking out, to see new willingness that people have to learn and educate themselves. And also it's been a reaction of relief to finally hear people acknowledge the change that needs to occur.
On that point, Will Smith has said racism is not getting worse, it's actually just getting filmed. He's describing 2020 not as being worse than previous years, but now we are just all seeing it personally. So regardless of your skin colour, we are now all witnessing the injustices that are taking place in society. Is this how you would explain why George Floyd's death in particular has caused increased outrage, when we know that many Black people in America have already been murdered previously, prior to his death.
Right. I completely agree. Anti-Blackness and racism in the form of physical violence, in the form of political and social oppression, interpersonal bigotry, and legal and institutional discrimination originated in the 15th century when Europeans first arrived on the African continent, and has continued to exist in various forms since then in, the United States, in the UK as well. So it never went away because it has been built into the origins and fabric of Western countries in particular. So I do think social media has forced people to be confronted with the reality of what Black people have always known from personal experience. George Floyd in particular, unfortunately, had to die on camera at the hands of people hired by the state to, as Americans say, to protect and serve. And that has made non-Black people, Black people, people of all races in the United States and worldwide have to think about this issue and have to be confronted with the brutality of racism. But George Floyd shouldn't have had to be murdered for people to wake up to this issue. I think many among the white majority, especially in countries like the United States and the UK, have to reflect on why it has taken visual evidence of such brutal murder for society at large to see racism as a relevant issue. So it is because people have been forced to see George Floyd's murder that this has exploded onto international consciousness. But I also think the world and the United States was at a point where, a point of fragility in a way.
Mm-hmm. You talked about the United States there and mentioned politics as well, and how racism, like structural racism, has kind of become grained into like large parts of Western society. Mm-hmm. Obviously, with this year being a US general election, there's kind of always a hope for change that can alter some of these with who you choose to elect in. So I wonder what your thoughts were on the comment that Joe Biden made, to paraphrase roughly, that you're not Black if you were considering not voting for him. And to kind of just add on to that, would you kind of then agree with I know some of the comments that Kanye West has made about like Planned Parenthood have been inflammatory to say the least, but he's also said that he feels that part of structural like racism has been this idea that the Democratic Party almost have a right to every single Black vote, and they almost treat the Black vote in America as a monolith or like a large block. So what would you kind of say about that? What would you feel about that?
So Joe Biden's comment, to start with that, it was both surprising and not surprising, because I do think there is sort of assumption that the Democratic Party historically has made that the Black vote is secure, because the alternative is voting for the Republican Party as a virtue of the United States and their two-party system. So I think Kanye West is a public figure who obviously is well known and has a large platform to speak on. But this isn't a new sentiment, and neither is he the originator of this sentiment. There are a lot of people who are calling on the Democratic Party to do more than just be less racist than the Republicans. There has been this historical assumption that vote is secure. And so I think Kanye West is obviously not a suitable candidate for such a high office, but there is some truth in what he says about the Democratic Party's treatment of Black voters.
Just to kind of follow up on that, I saw on the ACS's Instagram, on the little profiles they did when you announced your new kind of members, and like that you were going to be the political secretary, that you were most likely to become an MP. So I just wondered in your life, how is politics talked about? Like at home, your friends, like how do you talk about it? And like, would you say that you align to any of the political parties at the moment? Me and Izzy were talking last week that at the moment we don't really feel like any of the parties particularly represent us particularly well, and it's almost a choice between the lesser of evils at the moment, maybe. Depending on, like, just wondered how you feel about that at the moment.
So I guess growing up, I viewed politics as being an important vehicle for change because my family in Zimbabwe, particularly my maternal grandfather, was heavily involved in the struggle for majority rule and independence in what was then Rhodesia. My mum has told me stories about how as a child she once found guns hidden under a bed in the family home because my grandparents were helping to hide weapons for the freedom fighters. So beyond the importance of politics being emphasized, my mother was not particularly political herself. I think in my upbringing, she was focused on trying to foster and maintain pride in my own culture, on being a single mother and focused on her career and providing for me. But as is the case with many people of Generation Z, a lot of my interest in politics has been fostered by social media and interactions with my peers, and really the sheer wealth of information that's available to us to educate ourselves. In terms of specific alliance with a particular political party, I would say I align most closely to Labour, but I do agree with the sentiment that the way the political system is set up in this country doesn't necessarily include or adequately express the political needs and feelings and desires of many people, including myself. So the idea of choosing between the lesser of two evils, I do identify with that.
One of the debates that is being discussed at the moment is how we as a country and a world are seeing history, whether we see history from a too narrow a point of view. Did your upbringing ever make you think, why are they not talking about my culture in school?
Yeah, recently I have been reflecting on how many times I learned about Henry VIII and his wives at school, or how many months and months I spent during GCSE learning about the entire history of Russia from Tsar Nicholas II all the way up to the fall of the Soviet Union. And I have, especially recently, just wondered why the contributions of Black people like Mary Seacole to this country, or the Windrush generation, or incidents like the Bristol bus boycott of 1963, or the legacy of slavery in this country are not taught in schools. I mean, our own former Prime Minister, David Cameron, his family profited from and benefited from slavery. There's an organization called the Black Curriculum that is fighting for Black perspectives and history to be included in national teaching. And I really think this is vital work to be done, because people tend to have a skewed or rose-tinted and whitewashed historical perspective that has led to many people thinking that racism doesn't exist in this country, that we're nowhere near as bad as the United States. And I think that is partly because people are not being taught relevant history at schools. So it is a failure on the part of our education system to provide students and children that will become adults and members of society with relevant historical context.
Another debate that has arisen as a result of George Floyd's death is whether we should remove historical statues from public spaces. It shows that in our country we do have a problem, because some of the statues are particularly ambiguous. They stand on ambiguous moral grounds. I was wondering what your thoughts were on the situation surrounding Guy's statue, because when you ask the question, where did Guy get his money from? And the answer is, he had shares in the slave trade. I just wondered what your thoughts were on this particular issue.
in the cases of people like Thomas Guy or Winston Churchill is another relevant example in London, these people, their statues, we do understand that these people were not given statues, and these statues were not put up because of their racism or because of their connections to slavery. However, for Black people in the UK and elsewhere, these statues are reminders of people who profited from the sale and subjugation of human beings, or people who spewed verbal hatred and implemented violence and oppression. I mean, Winston Churchill being one example. If you are Kenyan, of Kenyan heritage, he was one of the supporters of concentration camps in Kenya that a lot of living Kenyans have never fully recovered from. So these statues are sending a message to Black populations that yes, philanthropy and political leadership are important to us, but slavery or racism or brutality are not morally objectionable enough for us to even consider why these statues are up. They're not morally objectionable enough for us to even have sort of a discussion in this country about the past of these people before we glorify them and we hail them as national heroes. A lot of people will say that removing statues or reopening discussions about people we consider to be national heroes is erasing history or trying to rewrite history. And I would say the opposite, in fact, that you have erased history by not including the racist past of these people in previous historical discussions about who they were and what their impacts were on the world. So, in fact, it's not erasure of history, it's adding to the context that we need to have about people, because nobody is perfect. And so it is really hurtful to Black people in this country that some people are just willing to overlook racism and slavery and subjugation because of philanthropy or being nationally heralded.
Last week we had Aisha Khan on, who was the person who started the petition to change the name of Guy's campus and to have the statues. And as a response, King's announced they will be removing the Thomas Guy statue, and they've also now updated the website to reflect his involvement in slavery, which is another point she raised. Mm-hmm. Would you say, as a whole, you've been pleased with the response of King's College from the leadership there, as well as the student union, who released a lengthy statement about in support of the Black Lives Matter movement? Or would you say it's good but need to go further, or would you just say they haven't, you're not pleased with it at all?
Within the ACS committee, we were slightly disappointed at the length of time it took for the statement that the King's principal and the SU president released together to come to light. And we were also disappointed in the lack of mention of systemic racism and of King's involvement in systemic racism, or even the idea of reckoning with previous injustice. We are glad to see that the conversation about Guy's campus and the statue of Thomas Guy is being had. But I don't want actions like removing a statue or renaming a campus to be one and done, incidents where it sometimes it feels like institutions or companies will remove a statue or rename something or create a diversity committee, and then they'll completely forget about the issue and move on afterwards. It really has to be a journey of anti-racism for King's, and it has to be a process in which the university looks at how across the board it can go forward and increase its efforts in anti-racism. So I have a sort of mixed view of the reaction of the college. in that there have been some good things that have been done, but it does need to go further, and it does need to be a continuous journey, because anti-racism is not singular actions or singular decisions. It's about a culture. It's about moving forward in a way that clearly values people of color and their contributions.
So, based off that, what kind of changes would you say the student union needs to make? I wrote for Raw News an article about the need for greater debate on campus as a way to help educate people on different views and kind of talk about some of the things that you've mentioned, and also the need to expand the accountability panel that they have, which can respond and better act to how the student union and inform us on how the student union acts to kind of limit racism and remove racism and kind of alter the structure of the university to make it more equal for everyone. What would you say like the student union and Kings together need to like do?
I would love to see in the future, and hopefully this year we'll be able to sort of drive this. I'd love to see more collaboration between student union authorities and the ACS. We would love to be involved in discussions about racism, about anti-racism. For Kings in particular, it would be great to see more Black and ethnic minority faculty. It is sort of an unmeasurable benefit for students, especially younger students, to see themselves represented in positions of power, in academia, in those who are teaching them. And so we would love to see that from the university. We'd also like to have a reassurance from them that this is not simply a moment, and it is going to be an ongoing journey of reflection and of change. But those are kind of my requests for the university.
You kind of mentioned there about wanting to see like people of color in like positions of leadership within academia. I remember I do war studies, so we talked last week about how we had a little discussion about if we thought that war studies itself was as a reputation for being quite a right-leaning subject, and kind of all the issues that come with the right side of politics. And there was one lecture at the very start of the year, one of those like introductory lectures, and it was about like who like the senior academics are, and they were all men, and it was like a big tree diagram, and it was like white man, white man, white man, white man, white man. And I think there was an audible kind of a laugh, like a kind of course they're all white men. What else would you expect as soon as it came up from most of the audience? I think that's really a thing that the university should address, because I think our university is all about learning from people with different opinions and different backgrounds, and that's how you get the best experience. But I suppose also one of the challenges for the university is going into this academic year, there'll be less students from abroad, things like that, and also the nature of giving professors tenure and therefore them having lifelong job security until they choose to end their tenure or they get fired for whatever reason. So I think would you say that whilst it can't be maybe an immediate process because of the nature of tenure and just the unfortunate way the way that universities work, would you say that there needs to be a gradual process over time for like the next time a position of tenure comes up?
Yeah, exactly.
A black person should be.
Yeah. No one expects the new school year to start with 20 new black professors suddenly appearing on King's campus and, like kente cloth draped over the entrance of the Strand. But it's more about committing to pursuing black candidates. No one is asking for you must hire a black candidate when every position comes up. It's more that there are clearly, I think I know of maybe one or two Black professors in the entire university. So clearly there is either an unwillingness to hire Black individuals, or there is no consciousness of the importance of increasing Black teaching and Black leadership within the university. It has to be a gradual process, and so many initiatives of anti-racism have to be gradual processes. That is just the nature of how, as you say, universities are structured. But going forward, I would love to see Kings commit to pursuing more Black leadership. And obviously that may take 5 years, it may take 10 years. I'd probably be graduated by the time the next one might be hired, but that's not what matters to me. It's about the process beginning, and about efforts being made in the context of this being an important issue to the university.
Do you feel that this period of time that we're in now feels like a time of change, a time where we can dismantle this systemic racism that exists in our education system, that exists in our justice system?
Yeah, so I would say that racism has been being built for hundreds of years, and so we cannot expect it to disappear within a single moment or a decade maybe. But I think this is really a moment in which there can be significant change made because of the visibility of this issue, because of the willingness of non-Black people to engage with discussions about racism. It's an institutional and structural issue. The reason that we don't have Black perspectives and Black history in national history curriculums is because leadership doesn't want to implement it. Former Education Secretary Michael Gove has talked about not wanting colonial guilt to infect children in our schools. And I think we have to realize as a society and globally that this is not about making people feel guilty. This is about being truthful about what is happening now and what has happened in the past, and moving forward in a way in which we work together to remove the scourge that racism is on our society. So I have said to my family personally that the last few weeks have felt like a revolution of sorts, because the world has not really seen attention on this issue on this scale, especially not in the United States, since at least the 1960s, or since maybe the 1992 riots after the assault of police on Rodney King. So this is a moment to me in which real change can be made, but it's an opportunity, it's not a guarantee. The structural power, government, individuals, educational institutions, parents, children, adults, teenagers, it has to be a universal commitment to removing racism from our society. And it won't happen, perhaps not even within our lifetimes. And I think we have to be okay with that. But I want to leave this world knowing that I have done as much as I can to contribute.
Last week with Aisha, we were talking about ways to address structural racism in the UK and abroad. So one thing we discussed was how Harvard are going to be removing the use of SAT scores from their application process, based on the grounds that it unfairly disadvantages many children from lower socioeconomic standings, and through racism often and sadly and wrongly has a large overlap disproportionately with ethnic minority groups. So would you say that that's kind of one of maybe a slightly more, well, say radical, a larger change that might work, especially within the kind of academia model, that you could see less or can see people from a disadvantaged background having an easier way potentially to get into education and therefore be able to better their lives through a variety of ways?
So I'm kind of quite qualified to talk about this because I went to boarding school in the United States, and I went through the American sort of admissions process and taking the SAT. And I would say that it is true that relying on what they call standardized testing, or what we think of as GCSEs and A-levels exams, it does put students of lower socioeconomic status at a disadvantage. I remember personally that by the time I moved school for sixth form and arrived in the US, my peers, many of whom were much wealthier, who were not financial aid students, had been paying for SAT tutoring for maybe 2 years before I even knew what it was, and had taken it maybe 3 times. And each time you take these tests, there's costs that you have to pay for to take the test. If you want to prepare well in advance, you have to pay for tutors, the cost of the books, and you are at an advantage if you go to a school that has maybe free preparation for it anyway. I think that there is a difference between the US and the UK in that the SAT is sort of a supplemental test that you take, whereas the United Kingdom's education system basically relies completely on exam results. And so it would be rather more difficult, not impossible, but rather more difficult to loosen the reliance of university admissions on exams, because in the US you also have other school grades to sort of observe or assess, letters of recommendation from teachers, that sort of thing, that we do not have within the process in the UK. So it would require a different type of thought about how else we would assess students. But it is true that children of lower economic status do perform more poorly in A-levels and GCSEs. And so I think looking at how university admissions take this into account is a great idea, but it would have to take a different form than the sort of process that's being pursued in the United States at the moment.
Yeah, just to add to that, something that I feel that I think the objection that a lot of people have to the Black Lives Matter movement, the people that say, well, no, all lives matter. I think a lot of the issue that they have is that a lot of these are people who they think that they themselves have been betrayed, obviously for a variety of different reasons. I think they feel that at some point, jobs have been exported abroad in manufacturing and like those kind of industries, and they've lost their jobs, and then they're living in areas with economic downturn and they're not working, and they feel that if you're just helping Black people because of something that happened a long time ago to be unfair on the issue, that they're then being left behind. But I think talking about education, that if you improve education for Black people or any ethnic minority, you're not just doing it for them, it's going to help everyone, and it will help people who feel that they've left behind. So I'm from a relatively wealthy area, but I have dyslexia. So I've always felt that kind of education and the standardized testing is particularly unfair for someone like me, but also for someone who doesn't have as good an education. So I think that not necessarily the strongest, I think the strongest argument for equality is just the moral argument and the basic fact that it should be there. But I think an argument that not without merit is that it helps everyone. Equality doesn't just help certain people, it helps everyone. I think that's something that everyone needs to try and realize when they talk about the issue, that it isn't just helping one group of people. Equality helps everyone long term.
Along those kind of lines of the differences between Black people and white people in Western society, how much do you subscribe to the notion that many of the problems Black people face in Britain are as a result of white privilege existing?
I think there needs to be a realization that the other side of the coin of racial oppression is white privilege. I think there is a misconception that because of the connotations people have with the word privilege, that if you have white privilege, your life has to have been one of privilege. And that is not what the idea of white privilege is trying to explain. What it is trying to explain is that none of the difficulties that you have experienced in your life are because of the color of your skin. And so I do think that the issues that a lot of people of color face in this country are because they lack that privilege, but it shouldn't be a pursuit of trying to gain privilege. It should be a pursuit of trying to equalize opportunity for everyone. So white privilege is an issue, but it is an issue because racism and oppression exists, not because the people who have so-called white privilege are people who've had completely easy lives, who are all wealthy, who have never struggled, who don't struggle with illness or any other type of sort of difficulties in their life. It's merely a statement of the reasoning behind different types of struggle.
And just to conclude the interview, I'm going to ask a question that's arguably been the underlying question of many conversations to do with race in Britain, and that is Britain racist?
Is Britain racist? That is a difficult question. I think people have different ideas of what they think racist means. I would say that yes, any country that has discrimination within its borders, any country that has structural and statistic differences between people of different races does have racism embedded into its culture. And so I think that, would I say Britain is racist? Yes, but that's not the only thing Britain is, and it doesn't have to be what Britain is. People should see it as an opportunity to pursue equality rather than a judgment on British character. Black Britons are proud to be British, and it is for that reason that we want racism to disappear in this country, because we want to be considered and treated equally to our fellow countrymen, if you want to put it that way. So is Britain racist? Maybe yes. That is only an opportunity to pursue equality.
If anybody wants to find out how they can get involved with KCL's African Caribbean Society, do you mind explaining how they can possibly get involved and join in?
Yeah, so KCLACS has social media pages on Twitter and on Instagram. We also have a website, and if you Google KCLACS Cares in particular, there is a lot of information about anti-racist sort of resources. And for anyone who wants to become involved with the society in general, we have meet and greets at the beginning of the year, and they are open both to people of African or Caribbean heritage, or just to anyone who wants to learn more about African and Caribbean culture, or about anti-racist efforts in general and issues that affect those communities. So we would love to have any of you, and hope to see some of you soon.
Thank you so much for coming on this podcast, Ayanda. It's been a brilliant conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.